The lakeside we enjoy and have cherished through generations is a gift. A gift from forebears Paul Snowden Russell and Carroll Duvall Mason, and from their friend Harold Higgins Swift. Harold Swift was born in 1885, the youngest of Gustavus and Anne Swift's 11 children. His father had amassed a huge fortune as a meat packer. Swift and Company prospered thanks to Gustavus's embrace of refrigerated meat cars. He'd begun using them in the early 1880s, and shipping processed meat rather than live animals ushered in a cheap meat boom. When Harold was born, Swift employed about 1,600 workers. When Gustavus died 18 years later, Swift had 23,000 employees. His son Louis said talking business was Gustavus's principal out-of-hours recreation, and Harold later recalled his father as a remote parent.
Father believed in a division of responsibility, and it was Mother's job to look after and to entertain the kids.
Harold Swift grew up in a house near Chicago's stockyards. When he was 13, in 1898, the family moved to a mansion, complete with servants' quarters out back, at 4848 Ellis Avenue. At that point, Gustavus Swift was turning over operation of his company to his older sons. He was generous with his fortune, giving freely to the Methodist Episcopal Church, the YMCA, and to the fledgling University of Chicago. Harold later recalled a rare outing with his father when he was just 8 to Chicago's Great Columbian Exposition. They rode on the World's Fair's big attraction, the first ever Ferris wheel, 264 feet tall.
I remember so well looking down below and saying to Father, "What are those new buildings down there?" And his reply was, "That's the new university that's being started here."
The University of Chicago, which had held the first classes on its Hyde Park campus just the year before the World's Fair, is where Harold Swift, Paul Russell, and Carroll Mason would come together. Paul Snowden Russell, born in 1893, was raised by his mother Adeline in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago.
His father left the family and disappeared when he was young. I don't know exactly how young.
Oak Park phone books offer clues. In 1895, the directory shows Paul's father, John K. Russell, who worked at his father's successful Chicago lumberyard, living at the Plaza Hotel, presumably with his wife and children, since her father had built that hotel. 2 years later, though, the Oak Park directory lists only Mrs. J.K. Russell. John Russell had left her with 4 children, John, Edwin, Adeline, and Paul, 4 years old in this birthday party picture from that year. Adeline died of diphtheria at age 5, and little Paul caught it as well, and legend has it was saved by a kitchen table tracheotomy performed by Dr. William Kidd, who would later marry Adeline Mayo Russell. We could not find pictures of Dr. Kidd and only a few of Paul Russell and his mother. She operated the Plaza Hotel, which the Oak Park paper reported was very fashionable in the gay 90s. At 4 stories, the Plaza was Oak Park's first skyscraper, built in 1892 by Adeline's father George Mayo to house visitors to the Columbian Exposition. Its dining room was the village's most popular eatery, particularly the 35-cent chicken dinner served on Sunday. Decades later, the Oak Park paper printed a fancy menu based on what was served at the Plaza in its heyday. The hotel still stands in downtown Oak Park, now part of the Carlton Hotel, the building having been given city landmark status in 1998. Oak Park was home to about 9,000 people at the turn of the 20th century, a pleasant, leafy town. As a boy, Paul Russell and his friends dreamed of becoming locomotive engineers, watching trains pass through. Many years later, Paul recalled in a speech to a corporate railroad meeting that he and his friends had pledged to each other they'd become train engineers. His friend Tubby Smith did go to work for the railroad and later told him, "President of a bank or not, in my eyes, you are a complete and utter failure." Paul Russell went to school at Emerson Elementary School and Oak Park High School and got good grades, all A's on one high school report card, though his algebra work was said to be not as good as last month. His senior yearbook, referring to him by his nickname Pete, declared him most bashful boy, but it did so in jest.
He had a special gift for people. Everybody loved him. And he just had a way with people that captivated them.
He was a people person, and he loved people.
He was a senior class officer. The Oak Park yearbook did not specify what office he held. The yearbook lauded his theatrical skills, playing Nanky-Poo in The Mikado.
Peter made an excellent lover. Russell was an excellent voice, and his acting was very well done. Would it tax our imagination too much to imagine ourselves seeing, someday in the future, Russell's name on some grand opera billboard?
His yearbook profile included a poem.
This good-looking chap is quite strong with the girls. He sings like a bird and is fast on his feet. In basketball, football, baseball, and track, many honors and glories have come to our Pete.
Pete Russell was a standout athlete, a speedy runner on Oak Park High's track team for 3 years, and, though he weighed less than 140 pounds, a standout on the school's football team, an extraordinarily strong team at that. They were coached by Robert Zupke, who would go on to invent the offensive huddle and the screen pass and win 4 national titles at the University of Illinois. Zupke's Oak Park teams often won in lopsided fashion. In 1910, they beat Englewood High 111-0, a newspaper account noting, "Darkness came on, or the village lads might have really made a high score." In that game alone, right halfback Pete Russell scored 6 touchdowns. An Oak Park columnist would describe Pete as
a ball carrier who could penetrate defenses like the north wind blows. A backfield genius.
In his junior year, Oak Park lost a couple of games but still outscored its opponents 261-18. They capped off the season with a Christmas vacation trip to the West Coast, beating undefeated high school teams in Oregon and Washington. The game against Wenatchee High near Seattle was cut short when the crowd began rioting over a half a carload of apples that had been brought to the playing field. The Oak Park paper claimed by beating the West Coast teams, "When Oak Park claimed a national title after the trip, there was none to dispute the fact." The next year, Pete Russell was the captain of a team that included 7 players who would go on to captain their college teams.
I imagine his leadership qualities were revealed by sports rather than created.
Oak Park was undefeated in 1911, Pete's senior year, outscoring opponents 331-12. They won the county championship, beating Hyde Park High 24-0, a newspaper account noting,
It took Russell only 3 minutes to make the first score, and after that, it was almost a joke. Except it is always sad to see a noble foe humbled in such awful fashion.
Again, Oak Park capped off its season claiming a national championship after beating St. John's Prep of Massachusetts, said to be the strongest team in the East. The Chicago Daily News chose Pete Russell for its area all-star team, even naming him captain due to his, quote, brilliant playing and clean demeanor on the field. The big man on the Oak Park campus would head to the University of Chicago in the fall of 1912. Carroll Mason was born in 1898. Writing later, she was a lucky victim of chance to be brought up at the edge of the University of Chicago. She was born in Kansas City, but moved to Chicago at age 3. If Paul Russell's family history was only sparsely documented, Carroll Mason's was elaborately cataloged.
My mother had me in when she was after 40 years old. By this time, my parents were fairly affluent, so I was the youngest, and everybody made a big fuss over me, I'm afraid.
Her mother, Hattie Duvall, had grown up in Ohio, near Marietta. The Duvalls were a well-established family, so much so that there's a town called Devola just north of Marietta on the banks of the Muskingum River, where Duvall's lock and dam are still located.
She was brought up on a farm and had the usual education of a farm girl in Ohio.
Hattie did grow up in the country and had a horse named Victor, but she was also sent to a finishing school in Cincinnati, which led to a months-long trip to Europe with the school's art teacher. Carroll Mason's father, Arthur, did even more exotic traveling, having left his native Australia at age 24.
Because he'd had an engineer's training in Australia, and he heard about the wonderful engineering projects in this country, the railroads were being built. And he really came over to find out.
Arthur Mason came to this country in 1881. This picture of him at a Chinese restaurant may have been taken in San Francisco or perhaps Portland, Oregon. That was where he signed up for a cattle drive. And Arthur Mason's fellow diner may have been Walter Mellier, the business manager of that drive. The cattle drive largely followed the old Oregon Trail, from Walla Walla, Washington, through Boise, Idaho, and east to Kansas.
And he used to tell about how the cowboys on Saturday, when they got paid, would all get drunk and sit around a campfire and sing songs.
Riding and roping.
Mason's grandson Arthur Cappan researched his travels and concluded,
His freedom during the drive suggests he was a paying as well as working passenger. Although he lived and worked the Spartan life of a real cowboy, he was able to take some time off for hunting, sketching, and assessing potential mine sites.
Arthur Mason's sketches of the journey survive. A ranch near Bellevue, Idaho. The military barracks at Boise. A ferryman on the Boise River. The Western saddle, different from the Australian version. An open cart used in the cattle drive. Detailed notes accompany Arthur's sketches of lava beds encountered along the route, and he kept a diary of the journey as well.
My pet old pony and I.
Arthur Mason left the cattle drive, going to work briefly for the railroad in Salt Lake City, and then moving on to Kansas City, where he was an assistant city engineer, eventually becoming the Public Works Commissioner. He married Hattie Duvall, whose family had moved to Kansas City from Ohio, in 1886. They had 3 children within 5 years, with Arthur working various jobs and inventing things. Either personally or through his company Hoover and Mason, Arthur would be granted 50 U.S. patents over 4 decades, starting in 1892. He invented excavators, devices for mining coal, dredging machines, and rail cars. But it was a Hoover and Mason invention in Chicago's burgeoning steel industry that brought renown to the company and wealth to Arthur and Hattie about the time their 4th child, Carroll, was born in 1898.
Father had done very well with one of his inventions that he called the grab, which was used to load and unload ore boats that came to South Chicago steel plant.
The Mason family, newly prosperous due to the grab, moved from Kansas City to Chicago, building a 14-room home at 5715 Woodlawn Avenue in 1903. A home designed by Howard Van Doren Shaw, a prominent architect, the author of many glamorous homes in Hyde Park, which was booming in the wake of the World's Fair and the opening of the university. The house at 5715 is still there, home to the university's Hillel chapter. Arthur and Hattie Mason lived there with their 4 children, Arthur Jr., known as Jack, Marjorie, Harriet, and little Carroll, the youngest by 7 years. She enjoyed advantages of wealth her older siblings had missed out on. A pony of her own named Major, kept at a stable just down the street. And a lot of parental attention.
Here I am with Mother in 1904, so I was 6. We were great friends. I was a terrible mama girl, I guess.
Carroll and Hattie sewed together, Carroll making doll clothes. Hattie was known for her compassion, becoming very involved at the university's settlement house near the Chicago stockyards. Carroll would inherit her mother's compassion and activism. Carroll was enrolled in the brand new University of Chicago Laboratory School, just 2 blocks from her home, in October 1903. The lab school's approach was based on the teachings of John Dewey, lots of learning by doing and encouraging experimentation.
I loved school immediately.
She would write later,
Classes were small, but the subject matter was wide. We were encouraged to make judgments rather than to remember facts.
Carroll had inherited curiosity and love of learning from her father. She called Arthur a perennial student, an engineer with a creative imagination. She would attend the lab school through elementary grades. She played Sleeping Beauty in a 3rd grade play and took a science field trip with her mother, also in the 3rd grade. In 1910, Hattie took her daughter to Europe for several months, compiling a photo album of the sights they saw. Hattie also sketching a butter wagon in Bern, Lake Lemans, now known as Lake Geneva, and painting the heath in flower. Arthur stayed behind, and a couple of letters from his daughter survive. Carroll complaining of the European kids in her school. All they do is dispute during schoolyard games. In 1912, the ever more prosperous Mason family built a weekend getaway in Flossmoor, about 20 miles southwest of their Hyde Park home.
It was a lovely house built on a 10-acre piece of land, which was quite attractive.
They named it Woodyats, after a home of the poet Robert Browning, who was a cousin of Arthur Mason's father, Cyrus.
It's a pretty big house. It had one huge room. You walked in, and you entered this huge room with a high ceiling, and it was one of the first places any of us knew that had very large glass plate windows. Everybody said, they were like Marshall Fields.
The land, near the edge of the Flossmoor Country Club, had acres on which to roam, and Arthur Mason had a pond dug on it. Though Carroll Mason always spoke fondly of her time at the lab school, after her freshman year at that school, she begged to be allowed to go away to the Hillside Home School in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Run by 2 aunts of the famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright, with buildings designed by Wright, the school had a working farm. Years later, Carroll would write that her year at Hillside was the school's next to last, and that she found it academically somewhat wanting, but added,
I treasure happy memories of rambles over the hills, sleigh rides in the deep snow, and 4-mile walks to Spring Green for an ice cream soda on Saturdays.
A surviving letter to her parents from Spring Green is effusive about the rambler roses in bloom, and mentions a teacher who tells Carroll he likes teaching her because she's so willing to learn. And the letter talks of a Professor Kell teaching her and other students a dance he'd learned from Pavlova, the leading dancer of the Russian ballet at the time, an early expression of Carroll Mason's lifelong love of dance and movement. She returned to lab school, U-High as it was called, for one final year, graduating, as was the custom at that school, at 16. There was no doubt where she wanted to go next, the University of Chicago.
I entered the university in the fall of 1903, 11 years after it had opened.
The campus was still under construction when Harold Swift arrived as a freshman, the only one of the 11 children of Gustavus and Anne Swift to attend college. He said later, though, he had no memory of regarding the place as new or experimental, though it was both.
Why should it seem new or experimental when there were 26 buildings built of durable gray limestone, which gave the impression of having been there a considerable time and that they would last forever?
He loved the place, and the place loved him back. Dorothy Swift, in her 1985 book Harold Swift and the Higher Learning, wrote, Swift was a man who inspired friendship. He was a staunch member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, which led to lifelong connections with fellow Deeks, including Pete Russell, even though he wouldn't arrive on campus until 5 years after Swift graduated. U of C administrators appointed Harold Swift a campus marshal in his junior year, citing his leadership in campus activity. Photos survive of Harold acting in various campus theatrical productions, showing a merry side that contrasted with his proper serious countenance in most photos. His sense of humor evident in the address he gave as class president in 1907. In a mock boast, he declared,
"We, too, are the greatest class ever graduated from the University of Chicago."
Adding that after 4 years of exposure to professors
great in knowledge and theorists, great in ideas, we are so great a class that in spite of them, we shall succeed.
After graduation, he took a job in the family meat business, but he often said that while he drew a paycheck from Swift and Company, his job was the University of Chicago. John Boyer wrote an exhaustive history of the U of C.
Even as a young alum, he was writing letters to Harry Pratt Judson, who was this kind of stodgy second president trying to get things going.
And Swift was often urging that stodgy university president to remain open to new ways of doing things.
An experimental university is a great thing. It is what universities in America need perhaps more than anything else.
Swift stayed involved in students' lives. His files are full of letters from U of C students asking for money for medical bills or housing so they could continue their studies. And copies of replies suggest they were accompanied by checks.
Extremely generous, but selective about that. He was very careful about everything he did. He kept good records.
Many of Harold Swift's efforts were aimed at those who followed him at the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, a group that would soon include Pete Russell.
He sponsored young men throughout his whole life, and I think my father was the first and the most significant.
Paul Russell arrived on the University of Chicago campus in the fall of 1912. Though he weighed only 137 pounds as a freshman, within a year he was a big man on that campus.
The flag of
As a sophomore, Pete Russell was named starting quarterback on the Maroon football team, which proceeded to win all 7 of its games, outscoring opponents 124-27 and staking at least an arguable claim to being the best team in the country. Pete Russell drew rave reviews for his running. Within a year, his coach, the legendary Amos Alonzo Stagg, was saying Pete ranked among the immortals of the Midway School. He was speedy and sometimes wily, his exploits chronicled by legendary sports writer Ring Lardner in the wise guy style of the day. Describing a 1914 punt return against Indiana, Lardner wrote,
"Picked it up on the bound and stopped running only when there was no farther to go. During this little 75-yard sprint, Pete was near enough to shake hands with almost everybody on the Indiana team, but didn't."
A trick punt return against Northwestern.
Russell caught the ball on his own 5-yard mark and stood there for several moments in deep meditation. The Northwesterners stood and watched him, unwilling to break the current of his thoughts. The Spirit at length moved Peter to run with the ball, but didn't advise him which way to go. He dashed first to the west side of the field, then to the east, and then, with his mind fully made up, started south. He was tackled and thrown after a brief romp of 40 yards.
He pulled a similar play against Iowa, catching the ball, standing still, and then taking off. Lardner dubbed him Deceitful Pete and added,
"He did not go all the way downtown, but stopped at 56th Street. As his stopping place was behind Iowa's goal, the alert officials called it a touchdown for Chicago."
Pete Russell was entertaining in other venues as well, performing on stage with the Blackfriars Musical Theater Group, playing a character known only as Wit in the Varsity Follies of 1915, and playing the hero in the senior play. Somehow he also wound up playing the Greek god Pan, prancing and playing the pipes at a lavish garden party at the home of Howard Shaw, again the architect who had designed the Masons' home on Woodlawn Avenue. Academically, Pete Russell did well. He too was appointed a university marshal at the end of his junior year, described in Oak Park's paper as being the highest scholarship honors, though that writer also suggested Pete's high school friends did not expect he'd be a star in the classroom as well as the football field. In his senior year, he won the Conference Medal of Honor, chosen from athletes at all Big Ten schools for accomplishment both academic and on the field of play.
I think he studied enough. He was interested in ideas, and he certainly wasn't a high-class intellectual later on in life, he became more interested in things like that.
Russell elected captain of the football team his senior year. At mid-season, his eligibility was questioned by some at the University of Minnesota, who claimed he'd forfeited his amateur standing by playing semi-pro baseball the summer before. Pete Russell denied the charges, saying he'd been in Chicago playing a lot of golf, and he remained eligible. Though the 1915 team did not equal the stratospheric success of his sophomore season, the Maroon teams won more than they lost in each season he was at quarterback.
I think he was a natural leader. If you look at pictures of him in college, he looks like a man in his 30s. I think he was somewhat mature beyond his years.
Pete Russell, a member of Delta Kappa Epsilon, had already become friendly with frat brother Harold Swift, who, 7 years out of school, had taken on a major role at the U of C.
I became the first alumnus trustee of the university.
To put it bluntly, he and his brothers had family money, and so and they had connections to the civic elites.
Harold Swift put his connections to work for the university in all kinds of ways. In 1915, for instance, he wrote the Swift Meat representative in Minneapolis, asking him to help Pete Russell and Coach Stagg find a good steak dinner when they were in town for a game. An early favor for the man who would be his best friend for decades.
They called each other bro. It was a very consistent relationship.
Carroll Mason was a freshman when Pete Russell was a senior and campus demigod.
And everybody knew Pete Russell. He had a charming smile, and he loved people, and people responded. And so did I.
Carroll's sister Marjorie was married to a Deke, so she'd been around Pete, but their first on-campus meeting was memorable.
Well, one day I was studying away in Harper Library, and the great Pete came in with a friend of his. I was busy studying, but I certainly knew that he came in, and I didn't look up, naturally. And they were possibly not studying much. And this creation suddenly turned to me and said, "Isn't that right, Carroll?" And I said, "Sure, Pete." And then he felt a little queer, and he said, "Well, it's all right. I know your sister, don't I?" End of conversation.
She wrote later,
Perhaps there was a bit of challenge in this exchange, but actually, I was undone. In a flash, I was overcome with an undying passion for this dashing and daring young man.
The interest was mutual. A few months later, when the Deeks held a fancy soiree at Chicago's elegant Blackstone Hotel,
And my beau was away in Arizona for his health, and he invited me to the Deeks ball. So pit-pat-patter.
Boom. Why does my heart go boom?
Upon graduation, Pete Russell applied for a job at one of Chicago's biggest banks, the Harris Trust and Savings, founded in 1882 by N.W. Harris. Harold Swift wrote a glowing recommendation touting his friend and protege as a
high-class, keen, aggressive young man.
Swift cited his friend's
enthusiasm and the energy he has always shown in whatever he has undertaken. He is a likable chap, quick-thinking and honest all the way through.
And Pete's renowned coach Amos Alonzo Stagg wrote of his quarterback,
He will do well in your business because, along with his splendid qualities, he possesses an engaging personality, is optimistic, and is not easily discouraged. I believe he will make good.
Years later, Chicago newspaper columnist Irv Kupcinet would paint Pete's application to the Harris Bank as a virtuous choice.
Pete Russell was unique among football stars of his era. Instead of attempting to cash in on his athletic reputation by selling stocks and bonds, he sought a sound, reputable outlet, regardless of how meager its beginning, for his talents.
In the 1940s, Finance magazine reported Russell had filled out his application to the Harris with characteristic modesty. Asked if he was good at figures, he replied, "Fair." Do you play cards for money, speculate, bet on the races, or engage in any form of gambling? Moderately, yes. Do you use liquors? Moderately and seldom. Speedy quarterback Paul Russell was hired as a runner for the Harris Bank at $10 a week, with a raise to $16 a week promised in November 1916. Because getting downtown to the bank was difficult from Oak Park, Pete Russell moved into the mansion at 4848 South Ellis Avenue, built by Gustavus Swift to house his large family. But by 1916, Gustavus had died, and his children had almost all left. Harold lived there with his mother Anne. But Pete's job, and any budding romance with Carroll Mason, were interrupted by war.
The call goes out and youth responds enthusiastically.
Pete Russell became one of the hordes of recruits signing up for military service in World War I. He went to officers' training school at Fort Sheridan, just north of Chicago. His presence there noted in the newspapers, worrying and even annoying Carroll Mason back on campus.
We thought it was very exciting to be a soldier and get killed.
The training is deadly serious now.
He could have gone into the AEF, American Expeditionary Force, which were the draftees. Very few of them ended up in Europe. But the regular army, which was fairly small in size, was sent over soon. And he said, if I'm going into the service, I want to go with some people who know what they're doing.
Harold Swift had an idea that would have kept Pete Russell off the battlefield. Swift had been tapped by the eminent Chicago Dr. Frank Billings, a colleague on the University Board of Trustees, to serve on a Red Cross mission to Russia, to bring medical supplies and, quote, do something to hearten that country, an American ally in the war. Swift made many inquiries about having Paul Russell added to the Red Cross team in late June of 1917, eventually finding the Army was unwilling to detach his friend for the mission and finding Russell unwilling to leave Army service. Swift withdrew his request and wrote his brother he wanted to make sure his friend's Army career would not be harmed by his efforts, adding,
If there is any feeling that there was harm, I would go to almost any length to eradicate.
Swift himself did some sort of Red Cross training at Camp Sherman in Missouri, and in July 1917, the Red Cross mission embarked on the ship Empress of Asia. Harold Swift's role in the mission was to advise on ways Russia could improve food production, both for its soldiers and civilian population. He'd done some homework, sending out inquiries to acquaintances and experts before leaving the U.S. The delegation went first to Japan, celebrated at a banquet thrown by the Japanese Red Cross. Their travels were documented by a Red Cross photographer. The album of the journey is in University of Chicago archives. From Japan, they went to Beijing, photos showing fishing on the Yangtze River, and a peasant hauling hay through a gate to the city. From there, the delegation boarded a train that journeyed through Manchuria. These men they encountered described as Manchurian outlaws in the album. The train carrying the Red Cross mission wound its way westward. There are photos of merchants at stations along the way, of sheep herds and women sorting onions, of seaweed harvesting at the Black Sea, a cart full of hay, a few military scenes, Russian soldiers at an encampment, an incendiary ammunition fire in Petrograd, Romanian soldiers doing drills, and a plane described as a Newport at an airport near Moscow. Pete Russell, meanwhile, had moved from Fort Sheridan to North Carolina for officers' training. There, he was training with the older brother of a friend of Carroll's. That friend invited her to come along to the Grove Park Inn in Asheville for Thanksgiving dinner with her brother and Pete Russell before they shipped overseas.
And I had some money saved up, and I'd pay my own railroad fare, so I did. And that put a little bit of warmth into this friendship so that I dared write to him as a soldier. I was very careful not to write very often.
He wrote back, misspelling her first name on one early letter, and signing off with a tepid "sincerely" in a letter from Fort Sill, Oklahoma in March 1918, after asking her to drop a poor soldier a note of brightness. But 3 months later, a letter from somewhere in France began "Dear Sweetheart" and signed off "Love, Peter." He sent a picture of himself on a horse and wrote enthusiastically of his experiences in France. The Army promoted him from lieutenant to captain.
He was very strong on responsibility, and he had felt that very strongly when he was in the war. He was responsible for his men.
He served in the Army's 5th Division, 61st Infantry, which took part in many of the war's major battles in the Meuse and the Argonne. A magazine profile of Russell said he was one of just 2 officers remaining in his battalion when Armistice Day came. And it came, according to Carroll, just in time. She wrote later,
He had orders to take a nearby German village the morning of November 11th, 1918. Through a woods, he could see the bristling machine guns awaiting his company's charge. But the message of the Kaiser's surrender came minutes before the attack was about to start.
Captain Russell stayed on for 9 months after the armistice, playing football in an intra-army exhibition game in Luxembourg, writing his family about the 3-0 victory. Back in Chicago, Carroll Mason heard from a mutual friend that he was thinking of staying in the Army. She wrote him a sharply worded letter urging against it.
Promise me not to do it without telling me first so I can argue you out of it.
She wrote, adding,
Come on back and play golf with me.
She drew cartoons of Pete scoring a touchdown and strolling arm in arm with a German maiden. Pete Russell eventually returned to civilian life in Chicago uninjured, but with health issues.
He told me he really got into smoking when he was in the war. He said, there's nothing that'll make you feel better when you've been shelled at night and it stops and you can sit in the bottom of a trench and have a cigarette.
And he'd developed gout that would plague him the rest of his life. Painful deposits of uric acid crystals in his feet slowed the athlete once renowned for speed.
He had 2 enormous big toes because of gout, and he found it hard to walk. I'd go out on walks with him sometime, but he was staggering along this vibrant athlete.
He hobbled along on the golf course everywhere and didn't complain much about it.
Carroll Mason was the class orator at her 1919 graduation, the convocation taking place just about the time Captain Russell was returning from the war. She worried he might not come by to see her, but after visiting the nearby Deke frat house, he came for a visit, and from then on, she would write later, things began to go my way. Dating Pete Russell meant spending time with his friend Harold Swift.
As our courtship progressed, Harold's car and chauffeur and extra tickets to opera or concerts were often at our disposal.
He was so generous to them. He was always doing things for them that were quite extraordinary for a young man as he was.
Because I was Peter's girl, I was included in several of Harold's luxurious trips to out-of-town Chicago football games. A private railroad car would take us to Madison for a game with Wisconsin or to Urbana to play Illinois. The party consisted of Harold, Peter, and me, and 3 or 4 other couples, all about 15 years my senior.
Pete Russell went back to the Harris Bank, now selling bonds throughout the Midwest, and for 18 months writing Carroll Mason regularly, often from hotels in medium-sized cities in Iowa and Nebraska. She saved many of those letters, though we don't have her replies. They are love letters, addressed to Girly Dear and Sweetheart Girly. In that letter, he describes his efforts to drum up bond business, signing off with a cartoon of himself as your drummer friend. Another letter ends with a plea that she
occasionally think about an old fellow named Peter Russell, and after you have thought about him, tell him about it, that he may be happy.
He writes of working hard.
I just drop exhausted at the end of each day. I think a few moments of the valuable experience I'm getting, how I love my little girl and what I hope to have it all mean to us someday, and decide to knock 'em dead tomorrow.
Though he proved a great bond salesman and sometimes crowed about successes, he expressed occasional discouragement as well.
I'm not a good enough man to sell securities in the state of Nebraska in these times.
In another letter, he complains,
I'm beginning to feel the confines of it all, the institution and the work.
He signs off one letter as the third-floor satellite of the Harris Trust and Scrapings Bank, adding, Harold sends his kindly respects. He pronounces himself tickled pink that his beloved Carroll and his best friend Harold had enjoyed a social outing.
You know how much I want the both of you to be the best of pals.
When in Chicago, he often stayed at the Swift home on Ellis with the friend he dubbed Higgity Swifter. Harold's middle name was Higgins. Pete humorously described an argument they had.
Hig blew up, I blew up. It was a grand explosion.
Letters sent from the Ellis address reached Carroll Mason at a number of spots. She was on the move, visiting Hattie's father, General Hiram Duvall, in Kansas City in January 1920, before journeying on to California that February. His letters to her there included a mention of how bank financing of water projects had allowed Southern California to prosper. She was visiting Lakeside, Michigan in July of 1921 at the home of U of C professor McClintock, who owned property south of where her own house would be built just 7 years later. Some tensions surface. He apologizes for wounding her with sarcasm at one point. "I'm sorry if it sounded mean." It wasn't the last time he wounded her with words.
Pete, when he loved anybody, was quite mean. He was mean to his mother sometimes. He'd tease her like anything. He was just horrible to me.
Letters reflect a lover's quarrel in May 1920. A challenge to the foundation of my love for you, he called it. But within a month, he was writing, "I live in the hope I may be fully deserving and worthy of your love." He'd already expressed his intentions clearly to her mother, writing Hattie in early 1920 about the actuality of his love for her daughter and predicting a great good future for them, adding, "Carroll lends courage to it all." But Carroll had trouble waiting for that great good future her beau was promising, recalling later,
My intended had a most admirable, if exasperating, quality of planning ahead and being sure of how and when he made each step, much to my impatience.
She really was getting physically ill because he was not marrying her. He wasn't going to marry her until he could afford to keep her properly. And it about killed her.
And he was very careful about providing. I think it was one of the major motivations in his life was to get to the point where we could be secure in a way more secure than he had been when he was young.
Finally, at the end of 1921, their engagement was announced in the University of Chicago magazine, along with that of Pete's football teammate Harold Gordon to Ethel Byford. Harold and Ethel Gordon would also spend summers in Lakeside for decades in the social orbit of Harold Swift. Paul Ruseell and Carroll Mason were married in Chicago in April 1922.
I was given $1,000 by my parents to buy myself a trousseau. And I picked out some lace material in a fancy dressmaker, and I got the damnedest hideous dress I've ever seen. And I thought of this rig on my head, like an American Indian myself.
Carroll's sister Harriet was her bridesmaid, and the best man, of course, was Harold Swift. Marriage came 6 years after that flirtatious meeting at the university library, and just days after a new contract from the Harris Bank took effect, promising Pete Russell commissions on his bond sales.
And here we are on our honeymoon. We were walking on a mud road, and we had a camera, so Pete got a long, slightly curved stick. We set the camera up, and with great delicacy he managed to press the trigger on the camera with a stick. And that's why we're so intense.
Within a year of his friend's marriage, Harold Swift would buy a house in Lakeside, Michigan, and a new chapter in the lives of all three would begin.